When the little notification popped up at the corner of my computer screen that morning, telling me the Zoom funeral would begin in 5 minutes, I did not yet know how much my life was about to shift, how the quiet space of my small living room would suddenly feel too full, too loud with emotions I had kept tucked away for years. Because until then, I believed I understood the limits of grief and family, the clear lines between who belonged and who didn't. But I was wrong in a way that would unfold slowly, painfully, and beautifully all at once. I sat at the small table near the window, my hands folded over a mug of tea that had already gone cold, the curtains barely moving from the soft breeze, and I watched the reflection of my own tired face in the dark screen while waiting to join the call, thinking of my cousin Emma who had passed only a few days earlier, thinking of how we used to braid each other's hair on the front porch as girls while pretending we understood the grown-ups' whispered worries. And now she was gone, leaving me with memories I didn't know where to place. Because grief at my age has a heavier weight. It stretches farther back, gathers more names, and leaves more empty chairs. And as the Zoom room opened, I adjusted my cardigan, straightened my posture, and prepared myself for the familiar rhythm of condolences and tearful nods between small video boxes. But instead, almost immediately, something felt different, like a tension gathering where it didn't belong. Faces filled the screen, relatives and old neighbors, some from states away, some from town, most looking just as uneasy as I felt, all of us sitting in separate rooms pretending we were together. And I thought of how strange it was that death now traveled through internet cables instead of crowded churches, how the sounds of crying were muted by microphones we barely remembered to unmute. And I found myself focusing on details to steady my heart. The way Aunt June dabbed her eyes with the corner of a napkin, the faint hum of someone's ceiling fan, the wooden cross behind our pastor's head, until suddenly a face appeared I did not recognize. A man, maybe in his 50s with tired eyes and a rough beard, wearing what looked like an old jacket too thin for winter, sitting in what looked like the corner of a public library or shelter computer station. And my stomach tightened because unfamiliar faces didn't usually appear in family calls. And when the pastor politely asked him if he had joined the correct meeting, the man leaned forward and said softly, "I'm here because I think I belong to this family." And the silence that followed felt louder than any crying could be, stretching across the screens between us, swallowing the gentle order we expected from a funeral. No one spoke at first, and I could sense everyone searching their minds for names, for faces that might match his, but none came, and I felt a strange tremor pass through me that I couldn't yet explain, as if something deep inside recognized him before my mind could catch up. And the man continued, his voice steady but thin, explaining that he'd been told about Emma's passing through an online obituary and that he had not wanted to intrude, but he felt he should be present even for a moment because he believed there was a connection none of us knew about. And I watched my relatives exchange confused glances, some whispering off screen to spouses, others clearly uncomfortable at the disruption. But for me, the discomfort reached deeper. It wasn't annoyance or offense. It was a fragile curiosity wrapped around an old ache I learned to live with, because I grew up in a family where certain topics were always brushed aside, where explanations stopped short of full truths, where the past seemed to have rooms we were not meant to enter. And as the man spoke, I began to feel that one of those rooms might finally be opening. The pastor gently suggested that any personal discussions be held after the service, but the man nodded and said, "Of course." Yet before muting himself, he looked directly into the camera and added, "I just wanted to see the faces I might share something with." And for one split second, his eyes met mine through the screen, steady and searching, and I felt as if I had been singled out for a reason I did not understand, my pulse quickening even as I forced myself to look calm, because years of being a mother and aunt had trained me to hold together when confusion tried to shake me apart. The funeral moved forward after that, the eulogies continuing as planned, but everything sounded distant to me, as if the words were traveling through water instead of air, And I could hardly focus on the pastor's prayer because that man's statement echoed inside me. I think I belong, looping through memories I had long stuffed away, memories of whispered family stories that never landed anywhere, of moments when I had wondered about missing pieces, but convinced myself it didn't matter anymore, reminding myself I was too old to chase mysteries, that a settled life was built on acceptance, not questions. Yet here I was, gripping my mug so tightly my knuckles turned pale, wondering why this stranger's presence stirred something I could not name. When the service ended and most participants logged off, my fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to disconnect or stay. My instincts divided between retreating to emotional safety and leaning forward toward the unknown. And as the remaining attendees lingered awkwardly, the stranger's box still present on the screen, I realized I could not walk away from that moment without at least trying to understand what had brought him there, because for the first time in years, my heart was awake to the possibility that my family story was unfinished, that beneath the sorrow of losing Emma might lie a revelation neither she nor I had ever anticipated. And while the rational part of me warned against false hope or misplaced empathy, another, softer voice inside urged me to listen, because sometimes life interrupts our grief not to deepen it, but to reshape it. And so I stayed seated in the quiet glow of the computer, breath slow, eyes steady, ready for whatever truth might step forward next. I remained seated long after most faces faded from the screen, the quiet of my living room pressing in around me until it felt almost too loud. And when the stranger's window also lingered there for a moment, without daring to speak, I watched him shift nervously in his chair, the stiffness of someone unused to being seen with kindness, and something inside me softened enough to make space for courage, because before I could talk myself out of it, I clicked the unmute button and asked in the gentlest voice I could manage, "You said you think you belong here? What do you mean?" And I heard my own words tremble, almost betraying my calm, as though my heart was stepping ahead of my mind for the first time in years. He looked startled that someone addressed him directly, glanced off screen as if making sure he was really being spoken to, and then nodded slowly, explaining that over the past year he had been trying to trace bits of family history he barely remembered, growing up without much information and gathering fragments whenever possible, a name here, a town there, a photograph found in a used book, until Emma's name appeared during one of his searches alongside an old address that matched one of the stories he'd been told about his origins. And though the details were thin, he felt a pull that led him to look up her obituary and attend the online service, unsure of what he would find, but certain he needed at least to witness the goodbye. I listened without interrupting, my chest tightening with each careful word, because the way he spoke sounded aching in its hope, but modest in its expectation, as if he didn't believe anything good was owed to him. And when he finished, silence filled the screen again, my thoughts swirling around what he'd said and what he hadn't said, a swirl of questions arising that I could not yet voice, about past secrets, about long-buried chapters no one had dared to reopen, about connections that time had not erased but merely hidden. And though I didn't yet understand what role I'd play in this unfolding story, I sensed that if I closed the meeting then and turned back to my quiet routines, something essential might close with it. So instead, after a long breath that steadied both nerves and resolve, I gently told him that our family wasn't always good at sharing its deeper history, that sometimes things were handled with silence instead of honesty. And I offered to talk again outside the meeting so he wouldn't have to carry his curiosity alone, watching relief flicker across his face like light catching water, as he thanked me quickly, the way someone does when they are not used to being answered. After we exchanged email addresses, the call ended, the screen dimming to my reflection once more. Only this time, the person staring back at me looked different, eyes more alert, heart heavier with questions than with grief alone. And I spent the rest of that evening pacing my small living room, replaying our exchange over and over,
my mind drifting through long corridors of memory where conversations had ended too soon or topics had been gently forbidden, remembering how my mother used to fall silent whenever family history wandered too close to sensitive ground, how older relatives would change the subject with practiced ease, and how I had learned not to ask because peaceful ignorance felt easier than troubled knowing. But now that ease was gone, replaced by an unsettled stirring that kept me awake well past midnight, unable to sleep because the stranger's voice echoed in my thoughts, more curious than desperate, more searching than demanding, as if he believed quietly that he belonged somewhere, even if he did not yet know where that somewhere was. When his first email arrived the following morning, brief and careful, thanking me again for listening and offering to share more if I wished to hear, I felt the same twisting mixture of apprehension and compassion tighten in my chest, because while part of me worried about opening emotional doors that might bring confusion or conflict, a deeper part recognized the bravery it took to reach out without guarantee of welcome, and that recognition stirred an old sense of responsibility I carried as a mother and caretaker, that sometimes simply listening is an act of belonging. So I responded, inviting him to tell me anything he was comfortable sharing, reminding myself to move gently, not rushing beyond what either of us felt ready to face. And over the next few days, his messages came slowly, each one unfolding another modest strand of his life, about growing up between temporary homes, about never knowing much beyond fragments of names and fading faces, about sensing a missing center he had never quite been able to name. And each note settled on my heart with greater weight than the last, not because of drama or accusation, but because of the quiet loneliness they revealed, the loneliness I knew too well from different circumstances, the kind that stretches unnoticed across years and asks nothing more than recognition. As I read, I began to feel something unmistakable grow between us, not proof or a certainty, not explanation or conclusion yet, but a fragile thread of human connection that did not depend on facts alone, a thread woven from shared need to understand where one comes from and what bonds survive absence in time. Sitting at the same small living room table where I'd waited for the funeral days earlier, sunlight now replacing the soft morning gloom, I realized that the stranger's appearance had done something profound. It had shifted my grief from a backward gaze toward what I had lost and to a forward-looking openness toward what I might yet discover. And though fear still lingered like a steady shadow at the edges of my hope, I decided I would not push him away or retreat into safe silence again, because some moments arrive not to disturb our lives, but to invite our hearts toward deeper truth. And I sense with quiet certainty that by staying present, by continuing to listen, I was stepping into the beginning of a story that neither of us had chosen, but both of us were unexpectedly ready to live.
In the days that followed those first emails, my home seemed to take on a different kind of stillness, the kind that feels watchful rather than empty, as if every familiar corner now held questions I had overlooked for years. And I found myself paying more attention to small habits and memories that had once gone unexamined. The framed family photos lining my hallway, the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed filled with keepsakes my children never opened, the handwritten recipes and my mother's looping script, all quiet witnesses to a story that had been shaped as much by what had been said as what had not. I grew up in a house where love was generous but history was guarded, where stories were softened before they reached young ears and where painful truths were treated like fragile objects too dangerous to touch directly. So instead they were wrapped in silence and placed on high shelves of forgetfulness. And while I accepted that pattern as normal through adulthood, now, reading the stranger's careful words, I realize how closely silence can resemble safety until it begins to resemble isolation, because unanswered questions don't disappear. They settle into the spaces between our memories, waiting for moments like this to rise again. My childhood itself had been an ordinary blend of warmth and struggle, shaped by my parents' steady efforts to provide calm despite modest means. My mother always humming as she cooked meals made from simple ingredients that somehow tasted richer than they should have. My father spending evenings quietly repairing anything that broke, as if fixing objects allowed him to avoid confronting the more complicated breaks he never spoke of. And though both loved openly, I remember sensing even as a girl that our family was the kind to avoid emotional storms by closing windows rather than preparing for rain, which meant some truths never blew in and some feelings never fully aired. When relatives gathered for holidays, I would sometimes overhear half-finished conversations that stopped abruptly when children entered rooms, their faces shifting instantly from intensity into careful smiles, and I learned that curiosity had limits if you wanted to preserve comfort. So over time, I folded my questions inward and focused on building a life that promised predictability, marriage, children, the reliable rhythms of work and routine, because stability felt like the best inheritance I could create from the partial stories I'd inherited myself. In my 20s, I left our hometown for a quieter suburb, started a family, devoted most of my energy to being the emotional anchor I had always needed growing up, teaching my kids to speak freely about their feelings even while I myself sometimes struggled to do the same, unknowingly repeating patterns I wished to change. But when Emma, my cousin and childhood confidant, visited, we'd sometimes slip into reflective talks after the kids fell asleep, sharing flashes of old memories and small suspicions about long-ago family matters that didn't quite add up. But even then, neither of us dared to push too far, satisfied with the safety of speculation rather than proof, unaware that our gentle curiosity might someday be interrupted by the real thing. Emma had always believed the past eventually finds its voice, and I'd smiled at her optimism, thinking some histories fade forever, yet now her words echoed strangely after her passing, as if timing itself had carved an unexpected doorway for truth to enter precisely because she was no longer here to walk through it with me. Meanwhile, my correspondence with the stranger grew slowly more open, our emails lengthening into reflections rather than updates, though he never pressed for answers or made direct claims about belonging. And I sensed he carried more caution than expectation, shaped by years of disappointment that had trained him to hope quietly rather than boldly. And that gentle restraint made me want to protect rather than retreat, because I saw in him the vulnerable bravery I'd waited for most of my life but rarely witnessed, the courage to ask belonging of a world that hadn't easily offered it to me. As for me, each message prompted deeper self-examination, raising questions about what I owed to truth after decades of emotional comfort built on partial transparency. And I wrestled privately with fears I could not admit aloud, wondering whether uncovering old truths could fracture rather than heal the family bonds I'd spent a lifetime nurturing, whether stirring the past might awaken resentments better left resting, or whether the not knowing itself was already the deeper wound we'd simply grown accustomed to ignoring. To steady myself, I dug out family albums stored beneath my closet shelves, gently turning curled pages filled with faded faces and loosely labeled names, noticing now what I'd overlooked before: certain absent relatives unaccounted for, sudden shifts in location or timeline that had once seemed insignificant, but now hinted at missing narratives. And though the discoveries were small, they confirmed something inside me had known all along. There were chapters we had skipped without truly closing them. Still, I remained cautious, sharing these findings with no one yet, not even my children who were grown with lives of their own, because I felt that this was something I needed to understand internally before drawing others into the emotional ripple, particularly because the stranger's vulnerability felt like responsibility, a fragile trust placed in my steadiness, and I didn't wish to shatter it with haste or misguided conclusions. So instead, I devoted myself to remembering, actively revisiting moments I'd previously brushed aside, the tense pause when family members were once asked about old friendships, the strangely evasive answers to questions about extended relations, the occasional presence of an unexplained letter tucked quickly into drawers, memories which, though once small and forgettable, now formed a quiet pattern too consistent to ignore, making the stranger's emergence feel less like sudden disruption and more like long-delayed alignment. Gradually, I could feel my emotional footing shift, no longer standing solely on certainty and acceptance, but learning to balance curiosity alongside compassion. And with each steady conversation with him, I became less frightened of the unknown, because his kindness never demanded anything of me except listening, and his presence gently reframed the story unfolding. This wasn't about uncovering scandal or blame, but about two lives meeting in uncertainty, both shaped by silences they didn't choose, both courageous enough now to lean toward whatever truth awaited them, even if the path forward remained blurred by unanswered questions and the quiet weight of family history.
As our correspondence continued, something subtle began to change in me, not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet easing of detention I had carried for so long about touching the past. And I noticed the shift first in ordinary moments, like standing at the kitchen sink watching water swirl down the drain, while realizing I was no longer automatically avoiding uncomfortable thoughts, or sitting at the edge of my bed at night rereading his messages with more openness than fear, because what had started as simple compassion was blossoming into a deeper curiosity mixed with courage, the kind that grows when you feel emotionally safe enough to explore hard truths. He wrote often about how rootlessness shaped his life, how the absence of clear family ties made him both fiercely independent and secretly longing for some sense of shared history, explaining that he never wanted to disrupt anyone's world but couldn't quiet the pull to understand his own origins. And each time I read those words, I felt a small ache toward both him and myself, recognizing how many years I had accepted emotional comfort over clarity without ever realizing the trade-offs I'd made. Around this time, I finally spoke to my sister on the phone, carefully and without mentioning the stranger directly, guiding the conversation toward old family stories we hadn't revisited in ages. And when I asked whether she remembered any distant relatives who had drifted away during our parents' youth, her long pause before responding confirmed more than any words could have, because hesitation speaks louder than certainty ever does. And though she eventually offered a vague explanation about family tensions she barely remembered, I could hear the residue of unease beneath her gentle tone, indicating layers left buried long before either of us were grown. After hanging up, I sat alone and reflected on how protective our family was of emotional peace, how even loving relationships can unknowingly build walls around difficult questions, and how those same walls may shelter comfort while blocking deeper understanding. And I wondered whether Emma's belief in truth's eventual voice had always been accurate, not because truth demands to be heard, but because human longing tends to seek it out when silence grows too heavy to bear. With renewed resolve, I responded to the stranger again, offering to meet in person at a neutral, low-pressure place where neither of us would feel overwhelmed, a quiet cafe not far from where I lived, and though hesitantly at first, he accepted, expressing gratitude and nervous excitement in equal measure, reminding me how courage often travels alongside fear rather than replacing it. The day of our meeting arrived bright and mild, the kind of afternoon where sunlight looks hopeful, and as I walked toward the cafe, I felt a peculiar blend of anticipation and grounded calm, aware that I wasn't chasing answers but honoring a connection born of empathy. And when he entered, recognizable from the small video square yet softer in person, I could see anxiety flicker across his face as he scanned the room, unsure whether he truly belonged there, until he spotted me and offered a tentative smile that carried both relief and quiet gratitude. And as we sat together over simple cups of coffee, our conversation unfolded gently, focusing more on life experiences than genealogy, on the jobs he'd worked, the books that sustained him, and the moments when silence felt heavier than solitude. And I shared my own stories of motherhood, of caring for aging parents, of learning to prioritize emotional patience over impulsive certainty. And within that everyday exchange, a fuller humanity emerged for both of us, not two people searching for labels, but two individuals recognizing shared vulnerability. Still, beneath the calm surface flowed an undercurrent of unspoken curiosity, and eventually, he admitted with careful honesty that part of him worried he might be intruding on a world that wasn't meant for him, wondering aloud whether connection without proof was simply wishful thinking. And hearing this, I felt sudden clarity rise within me, realizing how often we deny ourselves compassion simply because situations lack tidy definitions, and I gently reassured him that presence itself creates belonging, that caring conversations are valid regardless of outcomes, and reminded him that uncertainty does not diminish human worth. And while these words were intended to comfort him, they simultaneously echoed back to me like a personal realization, because I too had long believed family belonging came only from fixed identities rather than everyday acts of understanding. After our meeting, I returned home with emotionally tired but lighter steps, sensing that regardless of eventual discoveries, something meaningful had already shifted. My heart had reopened to complexity rather than hiding behind predictable narratives. And when I later sorted through the cedar chest again, this time viewing its contents through a new lens, I noticed an old envelope tucked between recipe cards and faded holiday letters, marked only with a single unfamiliar name written in my mother's hand, its simplicity strangely haunting, as if deliberately left both visible and unexplained. And holding it, I felt the first touch of genuine nervousness since this journey began. Because evidence, no matter how small, always carries the weight of consequence. Yet instead of fear freezing me into avoidance, I carefully set the envelope aside as something to explore in its own time, determined not to rush toward conclusions, but to move forward mindfully, respecting the emotional safety of everyone involved. That evening, I emailed the stranger to tell him how much I appreciated our meeting and how deeply I valued the calm honesty between us. And his reply arrived not long after, thanking me for treating him with dignity rather than distance, a phrase that lingered in my thoughts as I prepared for sleep, reflecting on how dignity is one of the most healing gifts between human beings, especially when offered without conditions. And drifting into rest with the growing awareness that this journey was no longer solely about unveiling a family secret, but about reshaping my own understanding of connection, vulnerability, and quiet emotional courage. knowing the path ahead would likely carry moments of pain alongside insight, yet trusting that the openness we were building would allow both of us to face whatever truths emerged without losing the tenderness that had unexpectedly brought our lives together.
The weeks that followed our cafe meeting unfolded with a gentle intensity I could not escape, as though the calm surface of my everyday routines now concealed deeper currents, steadily shaping my emotional landscape. And though I continued grocery shopping, paying bills, and hosting occasional Sunday dinners just as I always had, beneath these peaceful motions, my thoughts increasingly circled around unanswered questions that refused to soften with distraction, because the more naturally the stranger, now someone whose presence felt familiar, fit into my awareness, the more acutely I sensed the invisible thread tying our lives together, urging exploration even as it stirred quiet apprehension. We remained in steady communication, alternating between simple updates on daily life and more reflective exchanges about memories we couldn't fully place, and it became clear how similarly shaped our emotional histories were despite drastically different circumstances. Both of us raised learning to carry resilience silently, both taught to seek stability over confrontation, both reluctant to press questions that might disturb delicate emotional balances. Yet now those shared instincts were gently colliding with a mutual desire for truth, creating tension neither of us voiced directly, but both of us felt in the careful pauses between emails. My internal conflict grew as I contemplated involving my broader family, because I understood well how fragile collective harmony could be, how conversations about the past could quickly reopen wounds or breed defensive silence, particularly among those who had spent their lives protecting peace through avoidance. And I knew that introducing even tentative questions about forgotten connections might feel to some like an unnecessary threat to carefully built emotional security. Yet to deny the stranger the possibility of belonging or deny myself deeper understanding seemed equally unjust, leaving me caught between protecting familial comfort and honoring the quiet authenticity blossoming between two questioning souls. I often revisited conversations with Emma in my memory, her fond insistence that truth heals in unexpected ways, and wondered whether she might have confronted these questions more boldly than I was managing now. But even that thought was complicated by grief, because it felt unfair to imagine courage from someone who was no longer here to live out its consequences, while I remained responsible for navigating outcomes whatever they might become. Eventually, the tension followed me into direct encounters beyond private reflection, surfacing during a routine phone call with my sister when she casually mentioned a long-forgotten family disagreement that resulted in some relatives losing touch generations earlier. And hearing the phrase said so effortlessly awakened a deeper resolve in me, because losing touch sounded too polite to explain decades of silence. And gently but persistently, I asked follow-up questions until her voice shifted from casual to guarded, her responses growing shorter and less certain, as if stepping onto uncomfortable ground. And though I didn't mention the stranger explicitly, the emotional dynamic echoed the same pattern I now recognized everywhere: silence, attempting to preserve harmony by denying complexity. And when the call ended awkwardly, I sat reflecting on how much emotional energy families invest into maintaining surfaces rather than exploring foundations, even when the foundations themselves silently erode over time. My emotional unrest deepened into warm anxiety, not sharp or overwhelming fear, but a constant gentle ache that nudged me toward action, even as it cautioned me against haste. And I began journaling late at night to untangle my thoughts, writing about the meaning of belonging, about the trade between certainty and courage, about how age does not exempt us from emotional growth, but sometimes demands more of it, because we carry longer histories and deeper attachments that require extra tenderness when questioned, yet cannot remain unquestioned forever without dimming our capacity for authenticity. It was during one of these late-night reflections that I finally opened the small envelope I had discovered, my hands trembling with a respectful nervousness rather than drama, carefully unfolding brittle paper inside that contained an old note written by my mother, brief yet unmistakably cryptic, referencing someone who had needed distance for a time and whom she prayed would someday feel welcomed back. And though the names were few and vague, the tone resonated unmistakably with unresolved separation rather than estrangement alone. And I sat holding that fragile piece of evidence as if it carried not answers yet, but profound confirmation that questions were valid, that something unfinished truly existed beneath family memory.
With renewed complexity swirling in my heart, I decided to share this discovery with the stranger, but carefully, sending him only that I had found something suggesting lost connections, rather than drawing conclusions I couldn't prove. And his response came quickly, expressing gratitude mixed with emotional restraint, telling me he never wanted to burden me or disrupt family bonds, but that simply knowing someone was willing to search alongside him felt profoundly healing, a sentiment which struck me deeply because it reframed a narrative unfolding. This journey was not about demanding rights to identity, but about shared courage toward understanding. Still, my honesty now stirred unease among relatives when I began lightly raising broader questions at family gatherings, asking about old relatives or unexplained history in a way that felt natural to me but seemed unsettling to others, eliciting nervous chuckles or quick subject changes. And within myself, I felt a growing internal divergence between the woman I had long been, peaceful mediator, guardian of gentle silence, and the woman I was slowly becoming, thoughtful seeker, unafraid to name uncertainty, leading to quiet emotional exhaustion as I balanced preserving harmony with honoring authenticity, neither of which felt entirely negotiable anymore. During one gathering, as conversation drifted toward memories of grandparents and migration stories, I gently mentioned the note I had found, hoping perhaps shared curiosity might unlock collective reflection, but instead the room grew briefly tense, with one relative remarking that dwelling on old matters never helps anyone, and the table promptly shifted focus to lighter topics, leaving me feeling both isolated and quietly validated. Isolated because my curiosity felt unsupported, validated because resistance itself confirmed the relevance of inquiry. And later, that evening, alone once more, I wept softly not from despair, but from poignant clarity, reaching a deeper understanding that growth often begins not with explosive conflict, but with these gentle divergences between who we were taught to be and who we realize we must become. The stranger, sensing my internal strain despite my careful words, wrote compassionately, encouraging me not to shoulder the emotional weight alone, reminding me that seeking truth should never require self-sacrifice deeper than gentleness allows. And reading his message, I felt profoundly seen, not as a dutiful family guardian, but as a woman navigating emotional evolution. And his support anchored me momentarily when instability threatened to overwhelm, reaffirming that whatever lay ahead would be navigable so long as empathy remained at the center of our unfolding story. Yet beneath all these tender exchanges and cautious advances, the tension continued to build like distant thunder, subtle, steady, unavoidable, signaling that the quiet exploration we'd begun was inevitably moving toward a moment of confrontation when truths would press for clearer visibility, when surfaces could no longer contain buried narratives, and I found myself both fearful and ready for that arrival, knowing that rising discomfort was not the enemy, but the necessary bridge leading us toward whatever healing awaited beyond it.
As the days passed, the gentle tension that had woven itself into my routines gradually began to demand clearer direction, and I sensed myself standing at a quiet crossroads where remaining passive felt increasingly dishonest, not only to the stranger, but to the parts of me awakened by this unfolding story. And though no voices were raised and no urgent ultimatum spoken, the emotional pull toward action became steady and insistent, like a soft hand guiding my back forward whenever fear urged retreat. I finally decided to speak more openly with my sister during a visit to her home, choosing an afternoon when the house was calm and distractions minimal, explaining carefully that I had encountered someone from the funeral who believed our family history might hold answers about his origins, and I watched her expression change, not into anger but into visible weariness, as though my words stirred a weight she'd long carried without sharing. And after a long silence, she admitted that our mother once confided in her about a complicated situation involving a relative who disappeared from family contact under emotionally painful circumstances, details muddled intentionally to shield children and extended relatives from difficult truths. And though even she lacked full clarity, what remained clear was that separation had never meant rejection, only sorrow layered with fear and unresolved confusion. Hearing this felt both validating and heavy because it confirmed there was more beneath silence than simple forgetfulness, but also revealed how even partial truth creates emotional burdens for those who carry it quietly. And I felt a deep compassionate reframe take hold. Perhaps everyone in our family had acted less to conceal dishonesty and more to protect hearts they feared might fracture under too much complexity. This realization softened the internal divide I'd been feeling, replacing blame with understanding, allowing space to move forward without bitterness clouding purpose.
And after I shared my sister's limited recollection with the stranger, framing the information gently rather than conclusively, he responded with patient acceptance, expressing gratitude rather than urgency, trusting the process even when clarity remained distant. And that response deepened my respect for his emotional steadiness, appreciating how he balanced yearning with restraint, never crossing the line from secret to claimant. Still, uncertainty carried its own strain, and despite our mutual patience, moments of emotional fatigue surfaced. Subtle pauses in correspondence, hesitations during phone calls where words faltered, as though both of us hesitated to burden the other with growing complexities. And during those reflective silences, I turned inward once more, questioning my motivations and boundaries, wondering whether compassion alone could sustain prolonged ambiguity, or whether clarity had now become necessary not only for intellectual resolution, but for emotional health, because connection without direction can quietly exhaust even the sincerest hearts. Under the weight of these reflections, I chose to explore public records that were easily accessible, not with obsessive urgency but with methodical curiosity, searching through archived materials and family registries at the library, mindful to remain grounded rather than drawn into spirals of speculation. And though findings came slowly, certain patterns began to emerge that echoed my mother's note: altered names, occasional address changes, historical moments when distance appeared deliberately created, yet still nothing definitive enough to confirm the stranger's connection unequivocally, reinforcing the truth that personal history rarely unfolds in neat evidentiary chains, but rather in fragmented narratives requiring patience to assemble. Meanwhile, emotional ripples reached new layers when word of my inquiries quietly spread within the family through soft channels of conversation. And though no one openly confronted me, interactions subtly shifted. Phone voices more cautious, casual visits shorter, inquiries gently probing whether I was really all right, reflecting protective concern rather than condemnation, but still underscoring the discomfort my curiosity stirred. And these shifts saddened me, not because anyone behaved harshly, but because loving relationships were straining against differing approaches to emotional safety, some choosing quiet preservation, others choosing tentative exploration. And for the first time I experienced firsthand how conflict doesn't require raised voices to ache deeply, how emotional distance can emerge even within tenderness. The stranger too revealed increased vulnerability during this period, sharing that moments of hope now wrestled with moments of self-doubt, fearing that prolonged uncertainty might eventually end in disappointment. And I responded with reassurance drawn from both maternal instinct and newly forged empathy, reminding him that regardless of outcomes, our shared search had already proven valuable by fostering dignity, connection, and emotional courage neither of us had previously known. Words I believed deeply yet still felt challenged to embody consistently as my own uncertainty ebbed and flowed. One evening, while organizing old papers again, I revisited family letters, not searching just for names now, but rereading emotional undertones I had never paused to notice. Repeated references to missing you from afar, mentions of concern traveling without direct contact, clues subtle yet emotionally resonant, reinforcing the pattern of protective distance layered over unresolved longing. And in that tender discovery, I felt my heart shift once more from impatience toward compassion, recognizing that truth is as much emotional understanding as factual confirmation. Nonetheless, I knew progress could not pause indefinitely in reflection alone, and with greater emotional steadiness than I'd expected, I invited the stranger to accompany me to visit my sister, not to confront or demand answers, but to allow gentle human connection to precede any conclusions, believing deeply that personal presence can soften fears documentation alone never will. And when I extended this invitation, I did so emphasizing autonomy, that the decision was entirely his, and waited quietly without urgency, knowing trust grows best without urgency. When he agreed, after thoughtful deliberation, expressing equal nerves and courage, my chest tightened not with fear this time, but with solemn resolve, because stepping beyond private conversation into shared spaces signified a turning point, not necessarily toward revelation yet, but toward authentic engagement with the past and present. And as I prepared emotionally for this visit, reflecting on the boundaries of gentleness and honesty I wished to maintain, I realized how far I had already traveled from the woman sitting silently beside a cold mug of tea at the funeral, afraid to unsettle family peace, to the woman now willing to stand openly at the edge of emotional discovery, holding space for uncertainty while walking forward nonetheless. Understanding that rising conflict is not merely the tension between people, but the growth tension within ourselves when we choose vulnerability over avoidance, truth over quiet comfort, and empathy over fear. Choices that do not guarantee easy resolution, but do promise deeper authenticity, preparing all involved for the pivotal moments that awaited ahead.
The morning we planned to visit my sister together arrived with a stillness that felt deliberate, as if the world itself had slowed to acknowledge the emotional weight of what lay ahead. And as I prepared breakfast, I found myself moving carefully, choosing each small action, setting cups on the counter, folding napkins, straightening the table, with unusual mindfulness, aware that details often ground us when emotions threaten to rise beyond comfort. And when the stranger arrived to meet me, standing hesitantly on my porch with his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket, his eyes carrying both gratitude and anxiety, I sensed how fragile yet brave this step felt for him. And I silently honored that courage by offering calm reassurance and steady presence rather than eager anticipation. Our drive to my sister's home unfolded quietly, conversation light yet layered with unspoken tension. And as we passed familiar streets where my childhood unfolded, I felt a blend of nostalgia and vulnerability converge, thinking about the invisible lines connecting time, memory, and consequence, and wondering whether my younger self could ever have imagined that one day I would be guiding a near stranger toward potential family discovery, responsibly balancing both compassion and clarity without yet knowing what truths awaited. Upon arrival, my sister welcomed us politely but visibly uncertain, her smile warm yet cautious, demonstrating the same delicate balance I had come to recognize in myself, open-heartedness intertwined with protective reserve. And after introductions, we settled around the kitchen table with cups of coffee that remained mostly untouched, the air heavy not with fear, but with collective emotional attentiveness, like each of us unconsciously bracing for honesty's arrival without wishing to disturb the gentleness already present. I spoke first, explaining that our purpose gathering was not demand or confrontation, but respectful conversation, a mutual attempt to understand incomplete stories that had shaped all of us invisibly for decades. And as my sister listened, her eyes softening, she admitted how deeply family secrets had weighed upon her over the years, even without knowing their full scope, because responsibility can exist before clarity does, shaping long-held patterns of emotional caution. And hearing her articulate that burden felt like a subtle turning of emotional keys, unlocking deeper compassion between us. The stranger then spoke, voice steady but humble, explaining not his suspicions alone, but the longing behind them, the lifelong feeling of missing connection without accusation or entitlement. And his words resonated powerfully in the quiet room, not because of factual claims, but because of shared human vulnerability, prompting a visible shift in my sister's demeanor from guarded listening toward genuine empathy as she met his gaze with softened understanding rather than apprehension. Moved by this openness, she revealed more detail than she ever had before, recounting how our mother once confided that a young relative had become separated from family circumstances too complex and painful to navigate openly decades ago, involving misunderstood choices and emotional fear rather than wrongdoing or abandonment, leading to a gradual distancing born from unresolved uncertainty rather than lack of care. And while no firm evidence connected this story definitively to the stranger's life yet, the narrative vortex aligned unmistakably with the fragments he had gathered. And as we all absorbed this exchange, I felt a profound stillness settle, not from conclusion, but from emotional recognition, because something intangible had shifted from theory to lived, shared acknowledgement. I reached instinctively for my sister's hand beneath the table, feeling how both of us trembled slightly, united now in recognizing how much emotional inheritance weighs across generations, even when intentionally hidden. And in that gesture, I expressed gratitude, silent but sincere, for her willingness to share openly after years of quiet protectionism. Throughout the conversation, the stranger never demanded clarity, never pressed beyond what was offered, embodying such careful respect that I realized he had already earned something more valuable than confirmation, trust. And that trust became the true pivot point of our journey, because familial reconciliation begins emotionally long before genealogical certainty arrives. As discussions continued gently, layered with pauses and moments of reflection, I witnessed something rare, fear gradually dissolving not through forceful truth-telling, but through patient mutual understanding, illustrating how vulnerability invites connection far more powerfully than certainty ever can. and by the time the afternoon light began to drift lower through the windows, we all felt emotionally spent yet grounded rather than drained, as if carrying shared burdens had lightened individual loads. Before leaving, my sister asked the stranger quietly whether he would be open to continued communication without expectations, and when he responded with heartfelt consent, I saw something fragile yet luminous pass between them, an initial reciprocal trust where none existed days earlier. And as we drove home afterward through streets stained gold by late sunlight, I reflected on how the turning point of this story was not a dramatic revelation or public confrontation, but a quiet alignment of hearts where empathy replaced fear sufficiently to create emotional space for whatever truths might eventually surface. And for the first time since Emma's funeral, I felt a deep peacefulness bloom beneath uncertainty, understanding that we had crossed an invisible threshold from questioning to connecting, from isolation to shared emotional stewardship of our history. And regardless of documentation yet uncovered, the real transformation had already occurred within all of us, a collective willingness to sit with complexity gently rather than hide behind silence, marking the definitive turning toward healing rather than continued emotional distance.
After that afternoon ended, the days that followed unfolded with the peculiar quiet that comes after emotional breakthroughs. Not silence, but a softened rhythm where reflection naturally replaces urgency. And as I returned to my ordinary routines, washing dishes, caring for my plants, folding laundry in gentle sunlight, everything felt subtly altered, as if the world itself had gained new emotional depth because of what we now held inside. And in the evenings, I found myself thinking frequently of the stranger, wondering whether our carefully planted trust would take root in something lasting or simply remain a tender moment of shared understanding suspended in time. He called a few days later, his voice still reserved yet warmer now, sharing how much the visit had meant to him, how simply being heard without pressure had eased a lifelong ache he rarely spoke aloud. And I reassured him that the conversations had affected us too, in ways we were still processing, because healing often unfolds unevenly across hearts, some ready to leap, while others step forward slowly, needing space to adjust. I updated my sister about our brief call, and her response surprised me by how openly hopeful it sounded, admitting she felt lighter since releasing the family story she had guarded so long, as if verbalizing uncertainty had lifted an emotional burden she didn't realize she was carrying daily. And together we agreed to continue conversations gently rather than rushing toward answers, a commitment to emotional care over procedural confirmation, which became our unspoken guiding principle moving forward. Over subsequent weeks, we met occasionally for coffee or walks in the park, always keeping our interactions calm and grounded, conversations circling around everyday matters, favorite books, weather changes, childhood memories unconnected to lineage, deliberately choosing to build human connection before exploring familial possibility further, because something inside me insisted that people matter more than explanations. And in those gentle exchanges, I observed how trust grows organically, not from resolved questions, but from consistent presence. Watching him interact with strangers in cafes, offering quiet thanks to servers, or helping gather chairs after community talks, I gained deep respect for his character, recognizing how resilience shaped his gentle humility, and this realization softened any lingering anxieties I might have carried about outcomes, whatever truths lay ahead, because integrity itself had become enough reason to continue walking beside him. Meanwhile, my sister and I deepened our own connection, spending long hours reminiscing, acknowledging how silence around family mysteries had unintentionally created emotional distance between us over the years, and now open conversations revealed shared vulnerabilities we both once thought better left unnamed, forging renewed closeness founded on empathy rather than preserved decorum. I spoke often about Emma during these talks, describing how her funeral had unexpectedly catalyzed this unusual journey, and as I recounted moments of watching her life celebrated through digital squares on a screen, I realized how grief itself draws histories forward, prompting unresolved threads to surface in the aftermath of loss, because sorrow often creates the emotional courage to face what everyday life encourages us to ignore. Through careful reflection, I came to understand that the stranger's appearance had not ruptured our family story, but expanded its emotional perimeter, introducing compassion where rigid certainty once stood. And this reinterpretation shifted my perspective entirely. No longer did I view unconventional origins as threats to belonging, but as invitations to broaden what family means. Despite ongoing ambiguity, I noticed how peace gradually replaced earlier anxiety, how fear of being destabilized transformed into calm acceptance that some truths are less about evidence than emotional alignment. And this acceptance allowed me to be present without mental tug-of-war between skepticism and sympathy. One afternoon, my sister joined us for lunch in a small garden cafe, and observing the tentative yet sincere smiles exchanged across the table, I felt profound gratitude for human adaptability, our ability to meet uncertain truths not with rejection, but with compassionate curiosity. And that moment crystallized my realization: healing does not require final answers, only honest openness to connection. Because relationships grow through emotional integrity rather than verified narratives. Even conversations about boundaries flowed naturally, respecting privacy while remaining emotionally available, reinforcing a model of healthy engagement that none of us consciously planned but collectively nurtured, allowing space for individuality to coexist with emerging kinship. Late that evening, walking alone beneath fading streetlights, I reflected on how differently this story might have unfolded had fear led our choices, guarded hearts, dismissive assumptions, or defensive withdrawal. Yet instead we had chosen gentleness, and that singular choice rippled outward into emotional safety for all of us, confirming a truth I was only now internalizing fully. Vulnerability, though uncomfortable, forges the most enduring bridges between people. As the weeks passed quietly, each shared laugh or thoughtful conversation subtly reinforced that what started as uncertainty had matured into something steady, trust not dependent on final conclusions. And I slowly recognized how transformed I felt as well, more patient, less guarded, and newly attuned to the healing power within deliberate kindness. The turning point once felt like an event, but revealed itself as a sustained shift in our overall emotional posture, a movement from fear toward compassion, and that realization itself became the conclusion I could rest upon, knowing that regardless of how threads of lineage eventually aligned, a much deeper truth had already rooted itself firmly within our lives. Family is not defined solely by history, but by the courage to show up with open hearts when connection calls quietly for a response.
In the days and weeks following that turning point, life settled into a rhythm that felt quietly miraculous, like sunlight slowly filling rooms when shadowed by uncertainty. And I noticed how each small intentional act, answering the phone with patience, offering a warm smile to a neighbor, preparing meals without distraction, carried a weight of meaning I had previously overlooked, because I was no longer moving through life solely on autopilot, but with conscious awareness of emotional resonance. The stranger became a regular part of this rhythm, not in an invasive or demanding way, but through gentle check-ins, brief calls to share trivial joys, and letters recounting small victories or reflections on his own life, each communication subtly reinforcing that trust, once established, grows through consistency rather than grand gestures. And I marveled at how our mutual patience allowed the space for understanding to deepen without urgency, tension, or resentment, which in turn nurtured the quiet growth of empathy in all directions. My sister and I, too, found a renewed sense of closeness, no longer bound by unspoken fears or past grievances, and the conversations we shared became longer, richer, and more authentic, weaving together memories and insights that had once been compartmentalized, as if releasing long-held silences could create a tapestry of understanding far more intricate than any isolated recollection. I reflected often on how Emma's funeral, which initially seemed only a solemn closing, had inadvertently become the catalyst for transformation, opening a door into histories that were too complex to be neatly explained, yet entirely accessible through compassionate dialogue. And I realized that closure in this context was not a singular event, but a process,
a steady unfolding of emotional alignment that honors both absence and presence. During these weeks, I began visiting the local library more intentionally, not for research but for personal grounding, wandering through familiar stacks while mentally organizing fragments of family history, understanding how each narrative thread, partial, obscure, or distorted by time, still held intrinsic emotional significance, and how accepting these fragments without judgment allowed me to interact with both the stranger and my sister from a place of calm certainty rather than anxious speculation. The stranger, too, shared moments of personal revelation, small admissions of vulnerability and quiet gratitude, and each disclosure became a bridge connecting lives that, while formally unrelated for decades, now shared an unmistakable emotional lineage, teaching me that sometimes connection matters more than confirmation, that compassion often precedes understanding, and that mutual respect can carry more weight than documented truth, which gradually reshaped the lens through which I perceived both family and humanity. On more than one occasion, I found myself reflecting on the paradoxical nature of life, that the most profound truths often emerge from serendipitous or unintended encounters, that emotional courage frequently precedes factual clarity, and that openness to vulnerability can generate far greater resilience than years of guarded avoidance. And in this realization, I sensed a newfound quiet strength, a deepened capacity to engage with uncertainty without feeling destabilized, which became the emotional core of my ongoing journey. As our interactions continued, laughter returned in gentle doses, not loud or dramatic, but soft, enduring, and entirely genuine, filling spaces that had once been dominated by anxiety. And even small gestures, a shared cup of coffee, a knowing glance, a simple message of encouragement, began to feel like profound acts of human solidarity, reinforcing bonds that had once seemed improbable. My sister began contributing stories of our mother with more openness, unearthing memories previously withheld, and each story, layered with emotional nuance rather than factual precision, became a living testament to both family complexity and human resilience, allowing the stranger to engage empathetically without the pressure of proof, and teaching me that acceptance often outweighs interrogation in matters of belonging. Slowly, patterns emerged in daily life that were comforting rather than stressful, like the predictability of our regular walks or the simple pleasure of shared silence, moments in which presence itself spoke louder than words, and I realized how much healing is embedded in unassuming consistency, the quiet acts of showing up, listening, and being seen, which when multiplied across relationships, forms the invisible architecture of trust. Evening reflections often found me sitting quietly in the living room, considering how much growth had occurred in such a short span, yet recognizing that the real measure of progress is emotional steadiness, the ability to feel connected without depending on resolution, to sustain empathy even amidst ambiguity, and to nurture relationships without needing immediate answers. By the time the leaves turned in subtle autumn hues, signaling a shift in the year, I had observed profound transformation not only in the stranger, who now radiated a calm confidence tempered by patience, but also in myself and my sister, who both carried lighter emotional loads and greater openness to life's unpredictable yet meaningful encounters. And I understood that resolution does not require final answers, only consistent, compassionate engagement that honors both history and human complexity, creating a foundation sturdy enough for whatever truths or surprises the future might yet reveal.
As the weeks turned into months, the gentle threads of connection we had begun weaving solidified into a tapestry of shared understanding, subtle yet unbreakable, and I found myself noticing the profound ways in which patience and presence shape human bonds, far more enduringly than the immediate satisfaction of certainty or proof. The stranger, once tentative and quietly hesitant, now moved with a quiet confidence, bringing not demands but thoughtful attentiveness, often sharing small details of his daily life, humble victories or simple joys. And these exchanges became reminders that connection is as much about consistent empathy as it is about answers, a lesson that deeply resonated with me and my sister alike. Together, we learned to honor boundaries without creating distance, to listen without the compulsion to immediately respond, and to offer reassurance without overstating promises. And through this delicate balance, we began to experience a sense of stability that was previously unimaginable, as if our shared emotional investment had created a safe harbor for all involved, a space where past fears could coexist with present hope. Our family gatherings, once filled with subtle tension and cautious avoidance, gradually shifted toward warmth, as the knowledge that vulnerability could be embraced without judgment encouraged laughter, honest questions, and mutual care. And I observed how these small moments of ease compounded over time, reshaping patterns that had long seemed fixed and immutable, proving that the emotional resilience grows quietly yet profoundly when nurtured intentionally. I often reflected on Emma's funeral, the catalyst for this journey, recognizing how moments of grief can unexpectedly open the door to life-changing connections, and how sorrow, paradoxically, carries the power to spark courage, empathy, and curiosity, creating opportunities for healing that might otherwise remain dormant. The stranger's presence became normalized in the fabric of our daily life, not as a curiosity or an obligation, but as a companion in mutual respect and shared humanity. And I realized that the emotional safety we had collectively cultivated allowed for moments of genuine joy to emerge, laughter to return without hesitation, and conversations to deepen without fear, all of which testified to the remarkable transformative power of gentle persistence, patience, and listening. My sister and I also discovered that revisiting and sharing memories with honesty, without the weight of judgment or expectation, fostered closeness that had been absent for decades, illustrating that reconciliation is as much about emotional alignment and understanding as it is about factual clarity, and that once hearts are open, even partial truths can provide profound comfort. During solitary reflections and quiet afternoons, I felt the slow, steady hum of contentment that comes not from resolution alone, but from embracing the uncertainty of life with compassion, witnessing how relationships evolve, and finding peace in the delicate interplay of patience, care, and emotional presence, understanding that these qualities often constitute the real, enduring resolutions of life. Over time, the initial tension that had sparked so much internal and interpersonal reflection faded into a serene awareness of interconnectedness, that every act of kindness, every carefully chosen word, and every gesture of presence had gradually built a foundation of trust and mutual respect strong enough to weather the unknown still ahead, proving that the heart's capacity for empathy, patience, and love is infinitely more powerful than mere certainty, and that through these quiet practices, we had all come to share not only a potential lineage, but a tangible, living sense of family in its deepest, most human sense, a connection grounded in courage, understanding, and the unwavering choice to remain emotionally present even when answers remain incomplete. As the months continued to pass, I found myself reflecting on the journey we had undertaken, a path that began in uncertainty and grief but had gradually transformed into something quietly miraculous. Not because every question had been answered, but because hearts had opened in ways I had once thought impossible. The stranger, my sister, and I had learned to meet one another with patience, gentleness, and honesty, discovering that connection itself is the true measure of family, more enduring than any documented proof, more sustaining than certainty, and infinitely more transformative than fear. And in that realization, I felt an expansive sense of calm settle within me, like a warm, steady light that had slowly filled rooms once dimmed by anxiety and suspicion. The lessons embedded in our shared experiences began to unfold in everyday life, noticing small gestures of thoughtfulness, offering kindness without expectation, listening attentively even when words were few, and understanding that these moments, repeated and sustained, build the quiet architecture of trust and empathy that supports lasting relationships, far beyond the confines of formal acknowledgement or biological connection. I watched as the stranger integrated seamlessly into our evolving family rhythm, not as an intruder or curiosity, but as a fellow human navigating the same vulnerabilities, hopes, and fears, reminding me how profound patience and emotional care can be in bridging gaps that once seemed insurmountable. My sister and I also grew in ways I had not anticipated, opening conversations long held silent, sharing memories and reflections that deepened our bond, and discovering that even long-standing misunderstandings or guardedness
could dissolve in the presence of empathy, quiet respect, and shared intention, proving that love and connection often thrive in the subtle spaces between words rather than in dramatic revelations. Evenings became moments of reflection, quiet gratitude and mindful presence, sipping tea together, walking slowly beneath fading sunlight, or simply sitting in companionable silence. And in these ordinary yet sacred rituals, I felt the enduring power of emotional commitment, patience, and consistency, understanding that these are the forces that ultimately sustain human bonds and nurture healing. I realized, too, that the unexpected catalysts of our story, Emma's funeral, the arrival of the stranger, and the courage to embrace uncertainty, had reminded me how fragile yet resilient life is, and how often the most profound transformations emerge not from grand events, but from ordinary acts of listening, kindness, and willingness to be vulnerable. Each time I reflected on our journey, I felt the steady pulse of gratitude for my sister, for the stranger, for the shared moments that illuminated our humanity. And I understood that true resolution is not always about clarity or finality, but about cultivating a space where trust, love, and understanding can flourish, even in the presence of ambiguity. By embracing the unknown with open hearts and patient minds, we had all discovered a sense of belonging that transcends traditional definitions of family, proving that the deepest connections are formed not only through bloodlines or proof, but through consistent care, empathy, and courage. And in this understanding, I found a quiet joy and lasting hope, knowing that whatever unfolds in the future, we had already created something enduring, human, and profoundly meaningful. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice how this newfound harmony subtly infused every part of my life, coloring even the smallest routines with a sense of presence and gratitude, as though the act of showing up emotionally had expanded the capacity for joy, patience, and understanding far beyond what I had imagined possible. And I realized that the real legacy of our story was not the confirmation of lineage or the resolution of mysteries, but the quiet, unshakable trust and compassion that now connected us. My sister and I would often sit together for long conversations, reflecting on the past without judgment, laughing softly at the memories that once caused tension, and honoring those we had lost by carrying forward love rather than resentment, while the stranger became a consistent and gentle presence, offering insight, empathy, and a willingness to share without demanding, demonstrating that relationships built on kindness rather than obligation endure far longer than any fleeting certainty. I found myself increasingly aware of the subtle ways in which patience transforms hearts, how waiting without pushing, listening without correcting, and caring without needing reciprocation can create spaces where understanding and acceptance flourish naturally, and how the smallest acts of attentiveness ripple outward, strengthening bonds and fostering healing in ways that are both profound and enduring. Through these months, I also observed the personal growth within myself, a softening of old fears and defenses, a newfound clarity about what truly matters in life, and an appreciation for the unpredictable beauty of human connection, realizing that love, trust, and empathy are the true measures of family, capable of spanning gaps that once felt insurmountable, and forming a foundation far more enduring than any external verification could provide. Evenings often found us sharing quiet moments together, sipping tea, walking through familiar streets, exchanging stories, or simply sitting in companionable silence. And in those moments, I felt the steady heartbeat of shared humanity, the unspoken acknowledgement of what had been learned, and the profound reassurance that, despite uncertainty, we were not alone. Each of us holding a place in a circle of care that had grown organically through courage, vulnerability, and attentiveness. As the seasons shifted, I reflected on how this journey had reshaped my understanding of connection, teaching me that true reconciliation and closeness are cultivated through patience, empathy, and consistent presence, rather than immediate resolution or proof. And that even amidst ambiguity, it is possible to create an enduring sense of belonging and love that carries its own quiet certainty. I often smiled at the thought that the stranger's arrival, unexpected, tentative, and gentle, had acted as a catalyst
not only for discovery but for emotional expansion, prompting me and my sister to embrace openness, trust, and compassion in ways that enriched our daily lives and illuminated the power of human kindness. Ultimately, I understood that the ending of this chapter was not a conclusion marked by answers, but a continuation of connection, a testament to the enduring potential for empathy to transform relationships, and a reminder that by showing up fully and openly, even in the face of uncertainty, we create spaces where love, understanding, and hope can thrive, carrying us forward with quiet confidence into whatever the future may hold, and leaving a legacy far richer than any fact or confirmation could ever provide.